The grand arena of Veltorath existed for ritualized combat that combined martial skill with cultural pageantry, where galactic civilizations' warriors proved their worth through duels that tested ability while maintaining the protocols that prevented meaningless death. Champion Kesara Telvirin stood at the arena's center, her bioluminescent scars glowing with pride as the crowd acknowledged her 300 duel winning streak. Viren read combat history through bioluminescent patterns that formed during warrior rites, each mark indicating a ranked opponent defeated, each color variation denoting method of victory. Kesara's scars were a constellation of glory covering her arms and torso. 18 kills marked in deep crimson, 43 forced submissions in amber, countless minor victories in patterns that made her a living testament to Viren warrior tradition. She was hunting for her next challenge when she spotted him, a human sitting in the corner of the arena's preparation area, quiet and unassuming in ways that Kesara interpreted as weakness. Humans were relatively new to galactic civilization. Their combat reputation built more on technological advantages than personal prowess. Kesara had been wanting to test herself against Earth's supposed warriors to prove that Deathworld origins didn't automatically translate to arena dominance. She approached with the swagger of someone who'd never lost, issuing a public challenge designed to humiliate what she assumed was another soft species trading on diplomatic immunity. "Human," she said, loud enough for the gathered crowd to hear, "I challenge you to ritual combat. Unless your species' reputation is built entirely on weapons technology and you lack the courage to face me directly." Jackson Cole looked up from the tablet he'd been reading with expression suggesting he'd been hoping to avoid exactly this situation. He wasn't here to fight. He was providing security consultation for Earth's diplomatic delegation, only in the arena because his client wanted to observe Viren combat traditions firsthand. But the challenge was public, and refusing would create exactly the diplomatic incident his job required him to prevent. "I accept your challenge," Jackson said with the resignation of someone who'd done this before and knew how it ended. Protocol required pre-combat inspection, where both participants displayed their warrior marks, so the crowd could assess the match's significance. Kesara practically glowed with anticipation, her bioluminescent scars pulsing through colors indicating confidence and eagerness to add a human to her victory record. She displayed her marks with practiced showmanship. 18 kills, 43 submissions, countless lesser victories in patterns that covered her arms and torso like a map of her combat history. The crowd appreciated her display, 300 victories represented in light and color. Then Jackson removed his jacket for the mandated inspection. Kesara's taunting died mid-syllable. His body was a canvas of Deathworld survival that had nothing to do with ritual combat, and everything to do with Earth's casual brutality toward its own inhabitants. Shrapnel patterns from explosive decompression, the kind of scarring that happened when spacecraft hulls breached and vacuum tried to rip you apart. Chemical burns from atmospheric toxins that her database identified as coming from Earth's industrial zones, where environmental protection failed and humans just kept living there anyway. Distinctive tissue damage from radiation exposure that should have been lethal. Claw marks from what her combat database identified as Panthera leo, an extinct Earth megafauna that was apex predator before humans drove it to extinction. And cutting through all of this chaotic history, the surgical scars of military augmentation removal, precise lines indicating he once carried enhancements that were now gone, meaning he was fighting with purely baseline human capability. The crowd went absolutely silent. Kesara's threat assessment instincts started screaming warnings her conscious mind was still trying to process. Her 18 kills happened in controlled arenas with medical support, rules preventing permanent damage unless both parties agreed to deathmatch terms, and opponents who were trained duelists. Jackson's scars said his opponents were explosive decompression, chemical toxins, radiation that should have killed him, megafauna that nearly succeeded, and a planet that apparently spent all its time trying to murder its inhabitants. Her mark said, "I won fights." His mark said, "My environment tried to kill me daily and I'm still here." "Do you still want to fight?" Jackson asked quietly. "Or should we call this a cultural misunderstanding and go back to our respective business?" Kesara's pride warred with her survival instincts, but the crowd was watching, and backing down from her own public challenge would destroy her reputation more thoroughly than losing the duel would. "The challenge stands," she said, trying to convince herself that ritual combat was different from survival scenarios, that her 300 arena victories meant she was trained and skilled. The duel began under standard Viren rules. Hand-to-hand combat until submission or incapacitation, medical teams standing by, arena barriers preventing lethal accidents. Kesara opened with techniques that had won her dozens of previous matches, expecting to overwhelm the human with speed and strength that Viren biology optimized for. Jackson responded with economy of motion that came from military training where wasted movement meant death. He deflected her attacks with minimal effort, positioning that suggested he'd fought opponents much faster than Kesara numerous times before. The combat became education in the difference between someone trained to win duels and someone trained to survive absolutely anything. Kesara's techniques were optimized for arena conditions, for opponents who followed similar combat frameworks, for scenarios where rules prevented the most dangerous options. Jackson's responses suggested he learned to fight in environments where there were no rules, no medical support, and no assumption that he'd survive long enough to need post-combat care. He wasn't trying to humiliate her. His movements were defensive, focused on neutralizing her attacks without causing unnecessary damage. But the gap in their respective experience became obvious to everyone watching. 300 victories against opponents who learned combat in the same ritual framework she did, versus baseline human capability that included surviving experiences that would have ended her entire species. Kesara realized mid-combat that she couldn't win this, not because Jackson was necessarily more skilled, but because her body and training had no framework for fighting someone whose survival instincts were honed by facing death constantly rather than facing ranked opponents occasionally. She yielded with as much dignity as she could salvage. The crowd's reaction was complicated, not disappointed in her loss, but rather processing the uncomfortable realization that arena combat and Deathworld survival were such fundamentally different experiences that comparing them was like comparing ritual dance to battlefield medicine. The aftermath involved the conversation Kesara should have initiated before issuing a public challenge. "The shrapnel is from a hull breach during my military service," Jackson explained, seated across from her in the arena's medical recovery area. "The chemical burns are from Earth's industrial zones where environmental controls failed, and we kept working because economic necessity doesn't stop for atmospheric toxins. The radiation exposure was an accident at a power facility, where I happened to be close enough to receive a lethal dose, but didn't die because human cellular repair is apparently more robust than expected." He gestured at the claw marks. "The wildlife encounter was during a survey mission where we found megafauna our databases said were extinct, but turned out to just be endangered and very territorial. And the augmentation removal scars are from mustering out of military service. I carried enhancements for 8 years that made me significantly more dangerous than baseline, but regulations require removal when you transition to civilian life." "Your scars aren't warrior marks," Kesara said, processing implications. "They're accident reports." "They're survival history," Jackson corrected. "Earth doesn't do ritual combat. We just try not to die from industrial accidents, environmental hazards, wildlife encounters, and occasionally military service that requires removing the enhancements afterward." Everything you're seeing is the aftermath of surviving scenarios that weren't designed to test my worthiness, but just happened because my planet is dedicated to killing its own inhabitants through casual environmental brutality. Kesara looked at her own bioluminescent scars, 18 ritual kills, 43 submissions, 300 victories that she'd been proud of, and recognized they were fundamentally different from Jackson's survival history. Her kills happened in fair combat with medical support available. His survival history involved no medical support and opponents that were physics, chemistry, biology, and occasionally megafauna. I challenged an extinction survivor, she said quietly. From a world where simply living to adulthood requires defeating threats that would end my entire species. You challenged someone whose job was security consultation, Jackson said. But yeah, the Deathworld survival history is part of why I got hired for that job. Turns out that surviving Earth's casual brutality creates capabilities that most species don't develop through arena training. Kesara's report to the Virin Combat Council was extensive. Challenged human to ritual combat, expecting to prove that Deathworld origins don't automatically translate to arena dominance. Pre-combat inspection revealed that human survival scars have fundamentally different implications than Virin warrior marks. His body documented surviving explosive decompression, chemical toxins, radiation exposure, megafauna attacks, and military augmentation that was later removed. All baseline human experiences rather than exceptional achievements. Duel proceeded under standard rules. Yielded when recognized that gap between arena training and survival instincts was insurmountable within ritual combat framework. Recommend cultural exchange programs that clarify. Humans aren't necessarily superior warriors, but their survival history includes daily exposure to threats that our species encounters only in nightmare scenarios, and that difference creates capabilities that arena training doesn't account for. Jackson's log was more concise. Was challenged to ritual combat by Virin champion, attempted to decline, unable to refuse without creating diplomatic incident. Pre-combat inspection revealed that Deathworld survival scars have very different implications than ritual warrior marks. Duel proceeded. Champion yielded when she recognized gap between arena training and survival instincts. Recommend explaining to other species. Our scars aren't trophies. They're receipts for surviving a planet that treats every day as potentially lethal. Arena warriors train for specific combat scenarios. Deathworld survivors train by not dying from everything else. The Grand Arena of Veltorath continued hosting ritual combat, but after Kesara's encounter with Jackson, the protocols included new categories for assessing combat history. Arena victories versus survival scars, ritual training versus environmental adaptation, and the recognition that Deathworld legends weren't about dominance, but about enduring conditions that treated